All right, let's dive right into this explainer and decode the hidden architecture of how we actually teach creativity to kids. Have you ever wondered what exactly goes into planning an art class? It kind of feels like it should just be free-flowing, messy painting, right? But the reality? It's far more structured. Today, we're deconstructing an actual, real-world lesson plan designed for fourth-grade art students. Specifically, we're looking at a 50 to 60-minute module focused on creating art with shapes and colors. We're going to literally look at the exact document teachers use to guide young minds.
But before we get into the nuts and bolts of the curriculum, we have to ask this core philosophical question. How do you actually measure a child's imagination? It's a fascinating paradox, really. We're talking about 9-year-olds in a classroom setting. On one hand, art is the ultimate form of boundless subjective expression. But on the other hand, education needs standards, objectives, and measurable outcomes. So how do educators balance the two? How do they build a framework that encourages free thought while still making sure specific educational goals are met? Let's find out. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll follow the 60-minute journey of a single art class, moving from the initial creativity blueprint to sparking student interest, executing the 3-step process, grading subjective art, and finally wrapping up with post-lesson reflections.
Starting off with Section 1, the creativity blueprint, setting the standards. We begin with this blueprint, establishing the foundational rules and curriculum standards for these 9-year-olds. Now, looking at the actual administrative document that governs this vibrant classroom experience, it almost looks like an engineering spec sheet, doesn't it? But honestly, this rigid document is exactly what creates the safe space for a child's creative explosion later in the hour. It lays out the whole shebang, the unit, the topic, and the materials needed, like drawing paper, colored pencils, crayons, and markers. It really sets a highly organized stage.
So here are the 4 specific, rigid targets the teacher absolutely must hit before the class period ends. Number 1, identify basic shapes. We're talking circles, squares, triangles, and rectangles. 2, explain how colors and shapes can be used to create artwork. 3, actually create their own simple artwork using those shapes and colors. And 4, present and explain their artwork to classmates. Think about how methodical that is. It moves step by step from basic identification to comprehension to application and then finally to communication.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that understanding the mechanics of shapes directly unlocks the student's ability to express their imagination. The lesson plan treats shapes as the foundational vocabulary of visual art. It's kind of like how you need to learn the letters of the alphabet before you can write a compelling story. A student literally needs to understand circles and squares to draw the pictures they see in their imagination.
Moving on to Section 2, Sparking Student Interest, the 10-minute hook. Now we move into the actual classroom execution, starting with a 10-minute introduction phase.
Imagine you have just 10 minutes to grab the attention of a room full of energetic, easily distracted 4th graders. Well, this visual hook is exactly how the teacher reels them in. They don't just start lecturing or handing out paper. Instead, the teacher greets the students and immediately shows them several example pictures of simple artworks created with shapes and colors. Then, they briefly explain how artists use these elements to make interesting pictures. But the real magic happens in how they engage the students directly.
By asking direct questions like, what shapes can you see in this picture? And what colors are used in this artwork? The teacher transitions the students from passive observers to active participants. No way are they just sitting there staring at a whiteboard. They are actively hunting for triangles and rectangles in the examples shown to them. They share their answers and observations, warming up their visual processing skills before they ever even pick up a marker. All right, let's move to Section 3, the 3-step process, the main event. This is the climax of our explainer, the 30-minute teaching and learning activity where the kids finally get to create.
And this brilliantly illustrates the second half of our blueprint, where theory turns into hands-on student practice. Just look at how meticulously this 30-minute block is broken down. It's not just, hey, go draw for half an hour. It's a highly orchestrated timeline designed to ensure that those 4 learning objectives we discussed earlier are actually being met.
The 30-minute block is meticulously engineered into 3 distinct phases of learning. Step 1, demonstration. Step 2, student practice. And Step 3, sharing and discussion. Let's break down how this flow works to maximize both learning and creativity.
During the demonstration step, the teacher translates abstract concepts into relatable forms.
So the teacher gets up at the whiteboard and draws a simple picture using those basic shapes. A square and a triangle suddenly become a house. Rectangles and circles turn into a robot. By using familiar objects, the teacher completely demystifies the art process. They also explain how different colors make the picture more interesting, which sets a very clear baseline expectation for the students.
Now, during the practice step, students are given a strict parameter. They must use at least 4 different shapes, along with several colors. This constraint is an absolutely brilliant teaching tool. Sometimes, total freedom is paralyzing for a young mind. By giving them a clear rule, you must use at least 4 shapes, the teacher is basically giving them a creative puzzle to solve. And while the students work on their drawing paper, the teacher walks around the classroom offering suggestions and keeping them on track.
The activity wraps up with Step 3, which requires student volunteers to present their drawings and explain the shapes and colors they chose. This forces students to vocalize their creative process, cementing their understanding. It ties directly back to that 4th learning objective we saw at the very beginning. It's not enough to just make the art, they really have to articulate what their drawing represents and exactly why they chose specific shapes and colors.
Which brings us to Section 4, Grading Subjective Art, the Assessment Rubric. This is a fascinating challenge. How do we objectively grade a child's subjective art? We all know a teacher can't simply hand out an A for a pretty picture and a C for an ugly one, right? So how does this structured lesson plan handle assessment? Well, the teacher doesn't just grade the final picture. Instead, they rely on 3 methods: observation of the students during the activity, evaluation of the finished artwork, and the student's explanation during the presentation. It's a totally holistic approach to grading.
And here is how all that builds into an actual grading rubric. This matrix is literally the solution for bringing objective logic to subjective art. Notice how clearly the tiers are defined. For use of shapes and use of colors, getting an excellent requires creative and abundant use, while needs improvement means limited use. Even participation is rigidly graded. If a student rarely participates and doesn't verbally explain their work, they drop a tier. It leaves very little room for bias.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Post-Lesson Reflections, the debrief. This is where the teacher reflects on what actually happened after the 60 minutes are up.
Because every good plan requires a post-mortem to see how it survived contact with a room full of energetic 4th graders. Here, we can clearly contrast the immediate successes against the students' specific struggles. On the worked well side, most of the kids successfully identified shapes, enjoyed the activity, and were super excited to present. But on the needs improvement side, the teacher noted a clear gap. Some students needed a lot of extra guidance combining those shapes and needed help choosing colors.
Based on those exact struggles, the teacher adapts the blueprint for the future. The adjustment: show more example artworks to inspire students in upcoming lessons. This is a perfect example of responsive teaching. The teacher realized that while the basic concept of shapes was understood, the inspiration for how to combine them was kind of lacking for some kids. So to fix this, they're going to load the front end of the next lesson with even more visual examples.
And that brings us to the expected learning outcome. Students will understand how basic shapes and colors can be used in artwork and will demonstrate creativity by producing their own drawings. This quote perfectly encapsulates the ultimate goal of combining structure with imagination. It completely proves that creativity isn't just some invisible magic. It's a tangible skill. It's something that can be broken down, taught, practiced, and demonstrated through a really clear, well-planned curriculum. So how do these foundational creative concepts apply to the problem-solving we do in our everyday adult lives? As we wrap up this explainer, it's really worth considering how learning to build complex ideas from simple shapes isn't just for 4th graders. It's honestly a blueprint for life. Whether you're an engineer designing a complex system, a writer drafting a proposal, or a manager restructuring a team, you're essentially taking basic elements, figuring out how they fit together, and combining them to build something totally new. The curriculum for a 9-year-old just happens to use squares and triangles. So what simple shapes are you building with today? Keep that in mind as you tackle your next big project.